Welcome. I'm Inspector Purbright, and tonight I invite you into a new mystery.
In Flaxborough, a quiet English market town, the unthinkable happened. A groom collapsed at the altar on his wedding day, and everyone whispered the same thing. The bride killed him. But tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Has anything like this ever happened in your own town, when gossip ran faster than the truth? The people of Flaxborough, who prided themselves on being unshockable, discovered on a damp Saturday morning that even their solid English sensibilities had limits. The parish church of St. Swithin's was decorated with hasty roses, their stems still dotted with soil. The organist had prepared his usual repertoire of cheerful voluntaries that all sounded faintly like hymn tunes gone astray. And the pews were filled with hats, the sort of sensible hats that conveyed both celebration and suspicion, depending on which way their brims were tilted. It was in this setting that Miss Pauline Larch, soon to be Mrs. Colin Petherick, advanced down the aisle in a dress that suggested more economy than romance. She was pale, but then brides in Flaxborough often were, either from excitement or indigestion. What no one expected, least of all the groom, was that by the time she reached the front, Colin Petherick would be slumped against the altar rail, his head lolling to one side in an attitude more appropriate to a mortuary than a marriage. The first scream was stifled behind a veil. The second came from an aunt who had been waiting all morning for a reason to faint. The third, curiously enough, came from the verger, who had been so certain that nothing interesting ever happened in St. Swithin's that he nearly resented the surprise. By the time the doctor was fetched, a man whose bedside manner resembled the tone of a disappointed schoolmaster, the groom was beyond cure. He pronounced it sudden collapse of the heart, though with an air that suggested he would be grateful if someone later supplied a better explanation. It was only when Pauline Larch, still holding her bouquet with a grip that whitened her knuckles, failed to shed a single tear that the whispers began. "She never wanted him," muttered Mrs. Glibbs, who regarded herself as the town's chief authority on unwilling brides. "Poison in the wine," hissed another voice, though nobody remembered wine being served in church. The vicar tried to restore calm, but his sermon on the mystery of divine providence was not improved by the undertaker arriving early and standing politely in the porch with his measuring tape visible in his pocket. Thus it was that before Colin Petherick had even been carried out of the church, Flaxborough had reached its customary conclusion: the bride had killed the groom. It was at this juncture that Inspector Purbright, summoned from his tepid lunch of shepherd's pie, entered the church with his unhurried gait. He looked not at the body, nor at the distraught relatives, but at the bouquet Pauline had dropped in the aisle. A single petal had fallen across the stone floor, oddly out of place, as though a flower had lost its patience with the proceedings. Purbright, hat in hand, surveyed the silent congregation. His expression was courteous, almost apologetic. He murmured a few words to Sergeant Love, who immediately began jotting notes with an air of having something important to do. The inspector, however, bent down and touched the dropped petal with one finger. He did not pick it up. He merely straightened, looked at the bride, who met his gaze with something between defiance and despair, and remarked, in a tone more suited to a chat about the weather, "Well, Miss Larch, this is all rather inconvenient, isn't it?" The congregation leaned forward, hungry for scandal. The bride pressed her lips together but said nothing, and so began the case that, in Flaxborough, would always be remembered, sometimes with relish, sometimes with embarrassment, as the wedding where the bride killed her groom. The bells of St. Swithin's had not even finished their muffled toll before the first versions of the tale began their creeping passage through Flaxborough. By the time Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love had stepped from the church into the drizzle, the story had already taken on several competing shapes, each embroidered with such certainty that the listener could be forgiven for thinking half the congregation had personally witnessed the fatal moment from 3 inches away. At Mrs. Glibbs's sweet shop on the High Street, the account was that the bride had fainted before saying, "I will," and that, in the commotion, the groom had obligingly dropped dead. perhaps to spare her further embarrassment. Mrs. Glibbs explained to her customer, who had come in for a quarter of toffees but lingered for gossip, that fainting on one's wedding day was practically an announcement of guilt. "You'll see," she said, weighing the sweets with brisk taps of the scale. "It'll all come out. Poison or one of them foreign heart things. Same as you get from worrying too much about life insurance." Meanwhile, in the snug of the Feathers Inn, 2 retired postmen declared with the finality of men who had sorted parcels all their lives that it was plain as plain the bride had slipped something into the communion wine. "How else," said one, nursing his pint, "does a fellow keel over right at the altar? You don't get timing like that unless it's deliberate." The other man nodded gravely, as though he had seen a schedule of trains collapse in the same fashion. Sergeant Love, listening as discreetly as he could while waiting for Purbright to finish a quiet conversation with the vicar, felt the rumble of these stories like distant thunder. Love had an unfortunate tendency to accept gossip as the rough shape of truth until Purbright's cooler logic intervened. He tapped his notebook against his hand and muttered, "Well, sir, they'll hang her in. The market's square if we don't prove otherwise." Purbright adjusted his hat against the drizzle and looked at Love with his customary patience. "Oh, I think we might leave the gallows in storage for now. Let us instead assume that Mr. Petherick's heart gave up under the weight of his own optimism. It happens." His eyes twinkled faintly, though his tone carried no mirth. Still, it would be ungallant not to ask a few questions. And so the inspector began his circuit of the town that afternoon. Not in the manner of a man hunting criminals, but more like a gentleman making social calls. His first visit was to the bride herself, who had been conveyed, half in protest, half in necessity, to the home of her cousin, a Mrs. Frobisher. Mrs. Frobisher was one of those stout, decisive women who regarded calamity as an opportunity to display her managerial talents. She opened the door before Purbright had even raised his hand to the knocker. "Inspector, I suppose you've come to accuse my cousin of murder," she announced in a tone that suggested she would deal with the matter in the same spirit she reserved for an overdue gas bill. "Not at all," said Purbright gently, stepping inside. "I've come to inquire whether she has had tea. One must keep up appearances even in tragedy." This disarmed Mrs. Frobisher sufficiently to produce a pot of tea and 2 cups, which she banged onto a tray with such force that the teaspoon rattled. Pauline sat pale and motionless in an armchair, her wedding dress already exchanged for a plain grey frock. She looked as though she had aged 5 years in the past 3 hours. Purbright seated himself, poured tea with neat precision, and regarded her with the benign expression of a doctor waiting for a child to explain a rash. "Miss Larch, perhaps I should say Mrs. Petherick, though only briefly so, will you tell me what you remember of the morning?" Her eyes lifted, sharp for the first time. "Everyone thinks I killed him." Purbright sipped his tea. "In fairness, most of them thought you would not go through with the marriage at all. Their imaginations are easily employed." "I didn't touch him," she whispered. "Not once. He collapsed before I even reached him. I only saw his face go slack." She closed her eyes briefly, and the image seemed to swim across her eyelids. Mrs. Frobisher snorted. It was the shock, that's all. He was a delicate man. Never strong. Doctor should have told him to stay clear of wedding vows if his heart couldn't stand it. Purbright inclined his head. "Delicacy is a most inconvenient trait, especially in matrimony. Forgive me, Mrs. Frobisher. Did you see or hear anything at the church before the collapse?" Mrs. Frobisher pursed her lips. "Only the organ wheezing. And that woman Glibbs whispering about Pauline's gown. Nothing else." Purbright let the silence lengthen until Pauline looked at him again. Her face was taut, but there was a certain steadiness in her eyes now. "You must believe me, Inspector," she said softly. He did not nod, nor smile. He only placed his cup down with great care and said, "Belief is a luxury, Mrs. Petherick. I deal in patience." By early evening, Flaxborough had worked itself into a condition of feverish certainty. Half the town said the bride had poisoned him. The other half insisted she had not wanted to marry him and had therefore frightened him to death. Both positions made her guilty, which was the important point. At the police station, Sergeant Love produced a scrawled sheet of names. "Witnesses, sir. I've noted the ones who might be worth pressing." Purbright studied the list, murmured, and selected 3 names with his finger. The verger, the organist, and a Mrs. Bullet who had been sitting in the second pew. "We'll begin with those," he said, "though I dare say we may learn more from their manner than from their words." The verger was first, summoned to the station in a state of quivering importance. He explained in great detail how he had arranged the flowers, supervised the arrival of guests, and personally observed the groom collapse. "The bride's eyes, sir," he added solemnly, "were cold. Cold as a fishmonger's slab. I should know. I keep tropical fish." Purbright thanked him and suggested he hurry back to his tanks before they grew restless. The organist followed, sweating and fretful. He confessed he had been playing with more enthusiasm than accuracy, which might have unsettled the atmosphere. "But I swear, Inspector, when I glanced up from the keys, I saw her face, hard, like stone. If ever a woman meant ill, it was in that face." Said Purbright mildly, and wrote nothing down. Mrs. Bullet, a widow who had survived 3 husbands, entered with the air of one arriving at a social appointment. "Inspector, I can tell you now, I knew something dreadful would happen the moment I saw those roses. Red roses at a wedding. Vulgar, don't you think? Practically an omen. And her gown, such a color. A bride in ivory trimmed with gray, like a cloud threatening rain." She tapped her handbag for emphasis. It's no surprise the poor man dropped. When she had gone, Sergeant Love sighed. "That's 3 votes against her, sir, and that's before we ask the doctor." Purbright leaned back in his chair, his hands folded. His gaze drifted toward the rain-streaked window. "Yes, Love, it is all very convenient. One might almost think people prefer their tragedies to be explained before they occur. Saves them effort later." Love frowned. "Then you don't think she did it, sir?" Purbright smiled faintly, but his eyes remained unreadable. "I think, Sergeant, that people rarely perish at the exact moment most suitable for gossip. And when they do, the explanation is seldom as tidy as the gossipers would wish." Outside, the lamps flickered to life in the drizzle. Behind lace curtains, neighbors leaned close to share the latest version of the tale. In every telling, the bride grew guiltier, the groom more innocent, and the inspector more stubbornly slow. And somewhere in the quiet of his office, Purbright turned over the image in his mind. Not of the groom's collapse, nor the bride's pallor, but of a single rose petal lying oddly in the aisle. The morning after the ill-fated wedding, Flaxborough awoke with the vigor of a town that had acquired, at last, a first-rate scandal. The milkman found himself stopped 3 times before completing his round, not for the sake of payment, but to hear or share theories about the bride's wickedness. The postmistress was obliged to recount no fewer than 17 times how she had witnessed Pauline Larch buying 2 penny stamps the week before, which, by some inspired chain of conjecture, proved her determination to commit murder. Inspector Purbright, who had more tolerance for gossip than for facts delivered with excessive confidence, began his day with a stroll along Market Street. He carried neither notebook nor visible purpose, which unsettled the townsfolk more than if he had marched about with handcuffs clanking. People nudged one another as he passed, hoping to catch a hint of the investigation from the angle of his hat brim. At the Feathers Inn, the landlord was polishing the counter with exaggerated vigor when Purbright stepped in. Conversation dipped into silence, then scrambled back to life in a higher pitch. The inspector ordered a small ginger beer and accepted it as though it were a confidential file. He turned and regarded the assembly, who stared back like rabbits uncertain whether the fox had noticed them. "Morning, Inspector," ventured Mr. Hopgood, a retired schoolmaster whose tie was habitually crooked. "Grim business yesterday. Quite unchristian, really, for a bride to murder in church." Purbright lifted the glass to his lips. "Was it?" he asked mildly. "Well, Hopgood floundered. "That is the talk." "Talk," said Purbright, "is an industrious creature. It never needs rest. Unlike ourselves?" He nodded a courteous farewell and walked out, leaving the company to deflate in disappointment. Back at the station, Sergeant Love was waiting with a sheet of scribbled notes. "Morning, sir. I've made some progress. Dr. Binns has confirmed death was sudden cardiac arrest. He's prepared to sign it off as natural causes, though he admits the timing was, as he put it, decidedly theatrical." Purbright eased into his chair and regarded Love with benign patience. Dr. Binns has always been a critic of stagecraft. Still, we should not dismiss the possibility that Mr. Petherick's heart chose the most inconvenient moment for collapse. "Did Binns suggest poison?" Love hesitated. "He said no obvious signs, but he can't rule it out without tests." "And tests," murmured Purbright, "will arrive from the laboratory at about the same time as Halley's Comet." "Very good, Sergeant. In the meantime, perhaps we should look at Mr. Petherick's circumstances. Not all deaths are explained by the state of the body. Often it is the state of the living that provides context." Love brightened. "You mean family, money, grudges?" "Precisely. Let us begin with the more durable of human motives, property." Colin Petherick, as it turned out, had been a man of moderate means but extravagant ambition. His ownership of a small furniture shop had never quite kept pace with his schemes for expansion. He was known to borrow, cajole, and occasionally invent prospects to impress both investors and prospective brides. Pauline Larch, by contrast, had little fortune beyond a modest trust left by her late parents. Yet there was a rumor, only partly confirmed, that Petherick had been pressing her to place the sum under his management once they were wed. Purbright and Love called that afternoon at the furniture shop, which had been closed since the wedding. The assistant, a lanky youth named Edgar Clume, was eager to confide. "Mr. Petherick had plans, sir. Big ones. He was going to expand into fitted kitchens. Said it was the future. But he was stretched thin. Bills came in faster than the chairs went out. He'd been on edge all week. Said the wedding would settle everything." "How so?" asked Purbright. "Well, sir, marrying Miss Larch would give him her money. Least, that's how he put it. He said once they tied the knot, creditors couldn't touch him. He'd be a proper man of means." Love's pencil danced across his notebook, his eyebrows leaping. So the bride had a motive to stop him, protect her inheritance. Clume looked startled, then thoughtful. "I hadn't thought of that, sir. But she didn't look the type. Still, you never can tell with women." Purbright thanked him and left. Outside, Love puffed with the triumph of deduction. "There you have it, sir. She realized she was about to be swindled, so she struck first. Neatest explanation yet." Purbright, gazing at the damp cobblestones, murmured, "Neatness is rarely trustworthy, Sergeant. It is a quality more suited to accountants than to criminals." That evening, a fresh wrinkle appeared. The verger, whose sense of importance had swelled overnight, came bustling into the station with news. He carried a small paper bag as if it contained a crown jewel. Inside were several sugared almonds, slightly dusty. "Found these under the pew cushions, Inspector," he announced. "Wedding favors. Someone must have left them. Thought you should know. Almonds, you see, are often used to mask bitterness. Poisonous bitterness, one might say." Love eyed them with suspicion, as though they might explode. "Could be cyanide, sir. They say it tastes like almonds." Purbright took the bag, peered inside and closed it again. "Indeed, Sergeant, and yet it is remarkable. How many perfectly harmless almonds are consumed each day without incident?" He set the bag aside. Still, we shall have them tested. If nothing else, it will provide employment for the laboratory. Word of the almonds, however, escaped almost instantly. By the following morning, Flaxborough was unanimous. The bride had poisoned the sugared almonds and left them scattered as evidence of her spite. Pauline herself, secluded in her cousin's house, refused all callers and allowed Mrs. Frobisher to turn away reporters from the county paper. She had not eaten for 2 days, claiming food made her ill. Purbright considered this detail with mild curiosity. "One should not starve out of principle," he remarked to Love. "It does little to prove innocence and much to irritate hostesses." Still, the inspector's interest was piqued by another matter, Petherick's business debts. A discreet word with the bank manager revealed that several loans had been extended on shaky collateral. More curiously, Petherick had recently taken out a policy insuring his life for a sum that would, coincidentally, cover his outstanding obligations. The beneficiary, of course, was his bride-to-be. Love slapped the desk. "There it is, sir. He insured himself, she gets the money, and he dies at the altar. She doesn't just save her inheritance. She profits." Purbright, unperturbed, replied, "Unless, Sergeant, she had no idea of the policy, or unless the timing served someone else entirely." He tapped his pipe against the ashtray, though he did not light it. "One must ask, who benefits if both bride and groom are rendered miserable?" That question seemed almost whimsical to Love, but Purbright's mind was already tracing the outlines of discontent in Flaxborough's tidy facades. Behind lace curtains, envy simmered. Behind respectable shop fronts, debts lurked. The town was a garden of grievances, any one of which might blossom into something poisonous. The following day provided another twist. Mrs. Bullet, the triple widow, appeared again, this time at the station, declaring she had remembered something positively damning. She claimed to have seen Pauline drop her bouquet with an oddly deliberate gesture just before Petherick fell. "She flung it, Inspector, not dropped it, as if to rid herself of guilt. Mark my words, it was a signal of triumph." Love wrote this down with relish, but Purbright's gaze remained distant. The inspector remembered the petal lying in the aisle, singular and strangely placed. A flung bouquet might scatter many petals, yet only one had lain apart. He said nothing of this, but the thought stayed with him. By week's end, the case had reached a curious impasse. The town was firmly convinced of Pauline's guilt. The evidence, such as it was, painted her as both victim and villain. Yet Purbright remained serenely unmoved by the chorus of certainty. On Friday evening, as Love sorted papers, Purbright stood at the window of his office, watching the lamps glow in the mist. He spoke softly, more to himself than to his sergeant. "It is strange, Love, how swiftly a town will agree upon a villain, almost as if the truth were less satisfying than the comfort of blame. But somewhere, in all this neat suspicion, lies a very untidy fact, and it will not stay hidden forever." Love looked up, puzzled. "What fact is that, sir?" Purbright's smile was faint, unreadable. "The kind of fact that begins with something trivial, a flower petal perhaps, or an almond left beneath a pew. We shall see." And with that, he turned back to his papers, leaving his sergeant to wonder whether the inspector's patience was inexhaustible, or whether he too was waiting for the town's neat little tragedy to reveal the messy truth beneath. Rain clung to Flaxborough like a damp overcoat, seeping into its cobbled lanes and dripping from the eaves of its shops. The scandal of Colin Petherick's collapse had already matured into legend. Children were daring each other to run up the steps of St. Swithin's at dusk, as though ghosts would leap from the altar rail. Housewives lingered at gates long after laundry was in, piecing together scraps of gossip into a grander drama than the newspapers could ever print. Inspector Purbright, however, found the weather useful. Rain had a way of keeping tongues inside parlors, where their wagging could be tracked and measured. That morning, he set off in his raincoat, umbrella neatly furled beneath his arm, to call on Mr. Lionel Petherick, the groom's elder brother. Lionel lived in a semi-detached house with a garden of well-drilled roses and a hedge trimmed with military severity. His appearance matched his property. Narrow spectacles, hair parted with engineer's precision, and a manner so careful it might have been kept in a ledger. He invited Purbright inside with an air of a man performing civic duty rather than welcoming a guest. "You'll forgive me, Inspector," Lionel began stiffly, "if I say that this whole business has been conducted in a rather distasteful fashion. My brother's reputation must not be sullied by rumor." "Rumor," Purbright agreed, settling into an armchair, "is an ambitious substance. It spreads more rapidly than fact. Perhaps you can help me place matters on a firmer footing." Lionel clasped his hands. Colin was impulsive, dreamy. He entertained notions of grandeur, but he was not dishonest. Purbright tilted his head. "I have heard his business affairs were somewhat strained." Lionel's lips thinned. "That is not dishonesty, Inspector. It is optimism. He believed Pauline's inheritance would steady him. I, on the other hand, advised caution. He did not listen." There was bitterness there, faint but unmistakable. Purbright allowed a pause. "Did you approve of the match?" "I neither approved nor disapproved. Pauline is ordinary. That may sound cruel, but it is accurate. My brother required steadiness. She possessed it, that is all." "And yet," Purbright said gently, "the town now insists she murdered him." Lionel's expression flickered with something, relief perhaps, or resignation. The town will always prefer a scandal to an accident. It provides more conversation. As Purbright took his leave, he could not help noticing a detail by the umbrella stand. A walking stick with a silver knob. It bore faint scratches along its length, as if it had been struck against stone. He asked no questions then, but filed the image away. At the station later, Sergeant Love reported fresh excitement. "Mrs. Glibbs swears she saw Pauline buying rat poison last month, sir. Says she remembers because Pauline asked for a paper bag rather than the usual twist of newspaper." "Indeed," Purbright murmured. "Did she happen to recall whether it was for rats?" Love frowned. "She claims Pauline never said. But what else could it be for?" Purbright refrained from pointing out that gossip, once primed, would transform a request for talcum powder into a weapon. Instead, he suggested love check with the ironmonger's records. If rat poison had been sold, there would be a receipt. When Love returned that afternoon, his notebook bore a new disappointment. Turns out the purchase was by a Mrs. Pullet, not Pauline. Glibbs mixed them up. Pullet's garden shed was overrun with mice. Purbright said, as though unsurprised. "One should always check with the mice. They are less prone to exaggeration." That evening brought another development, though in an unexpected place: the offices of the Flaxborough Gazette. Purbright stopped by under the pretense of reading the notices, but in truth to catch the scent of what the press intended to fan into headlines. The editor, Mr. Mortlake, was a man whose moustache suggested greater seriousness than his articles often delivered. "Inspector," he said, rubbing his hands together, "I'm told you've practically arrested the bride. Makes for excellent copy. Murder at the altar. Front page, with photograph." Purbright's expression remained courteous. "We have arrested no one, and I would be grateful if you explained as much in your paper." Mortlake looked crestfallen. "But the public—" "Will be more grateful," Purbright interrupted, "for accuracy. We should not deprive them of the pleasure of future revelations by settling too soon." The editor sighed and shuffled his notes. Yet as Purbright left, he noticed a discarded sheet in the wastepaper basket, a letter addressed to the Gazette, unsigned, claiming that Pauline had once been seen in the company of another man late at night. A vague accusation, but one certain to inflame suspicion. Purbright tucked the image of that letter into his mind beside the silver-knobbed walking stick. The following day brought the first genuine crack in the tidy narrative of Pauline's guilt. A boy delivering coal to the rear of Petherick's furniture shop stumbled across a crumpled envelope in the yard. Inside was a letter, smudged with damp but legible enough. "Colin, this cannot continue. I will not be made a fool. Break it off, or it will end badly for you." It bore no signature, but the handwriting, once compared, matched that of Lionel Petherick. Sergeant Love nearly toppled with excitement. "There it is, sir. A threat, plain as daylight. If Lionel warned him, he had reason, and reason means motive." Purbright studied the letter in silence. He tapped its edge against his palm, then slipped it into an envelope. "Motive, Sergeant, is not always the property of the writer. Sometimes it belongs to the reader." Love blinked. "You mean Colin may have used it?" "I mean," Purbright said softly, "that those who argue most loudly for respectability often have more to conceal than those accused of scandal." Meanwhile, Pauline Larch sat in her cousin's parlour, staring at her untouched supper. Her face had grown thinner, her manner more remote. Mrs. Frobisher fluttered about indignantly, scolding the neighbours for their cruel assumptions. Yet when Purbright arrived, Pauline spoke before her cousin could open her mouth. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I am innocent. But I feel as though the town wants me guilty. They watch me through the curtains. They whisper when I walk past. How do you fight that?" Purbright regarded her with a kind of paternal gravity. "By outlasting it. Towns, like storms, exhaust themselves eventually. In the meantime, tell me, had your husband to be any quarrels of late?" She hesitated. With Lionel, they argued often. Lionel said Colin was reckless, that he'd ruin the family name. Colin mocked him, called him a miser, but it was only words. Purbright inclined his head. Words are often the beginning of deeds. That night, the inspector sat in his office long after Love had gone home. The rain had ceased, leaving the streets slick and shining. He spread before him 3 small tokens: the letter from Lionel, the memory of the bouquet petal, and the almonds in their paper bag. None was enough in itself, yet together they formed a pattern of untidiness in what the town insisted was a neat crime. He leaned back, fingers steepled. In Flaxborough, people preferred a culprit to a puzzle. Pauline was convenient, her pale silence lending weight to their suspicions. But Purbright knew too well that convenience was the enemy of truth. And somewhere, he thought, was someone for whom Colin Petherick's death was not tragedy, nor scandal, but relief. The inspector closed his eyes briefly, as if listening for the faintest creak of motive in the machinery of the town. Then he extinguished the lamp, leaving the office in darkness. Outside, the river lapped faintly at its banks, carrying whispers of secrets downstream. And in the houses of Flaxborough, curtains twitched while the rain-washed cobbles reflected lamplight like the watchful eyes of the town itself, hungry, certain, and wrong. The days following the discovery of Lionel Petherick's letter were like a drafty pause in a play. Everyone in Flaxborough seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the inspector to stride forward and deliver the inevitable accusation. The town had already rehearsed the denouement so thoroughly. Pauline in the dock, head bowed, guilt radiating from every seam of her plain grey frock, that they could hardly imagine any other outcome. And yet Inspector Purbright, with maddening restraint, gave them nothing. He continued his rounds of the town in his steady, unhurried fashion, nodding to shopkeepers, pausing at corners, asking polite questions whose significance slipped like water through the fingers of those he questioned. By the 5th day, the townsfolk were beginning to grow impatient. A good scandal, like fresh bread, could not be left too long before turning stale. Sergeant Love, too, was restless. He carried Lionel's threatening letter in his pocket like a personal trophy, eager to brandish it at every opportunity. "We have him, sir," he insisted one morning as Purbright strolled into the station, umbrella dripping. A quarrel between brothers, a letter full of threats, and, if you'll forgive me, Lionel's sour face every time the bride's name is mentioned. Why, it's obvious. Purbright set his hat carefully on the peg, then moved to the window, looking out at the marketplace where stalls gleamed with rain. Obvious love is a treacherous word. It promises more than it delivers. He turned back. "Nevertheless, you may go and pay Mr. Lionel Petherick a visit, but do try, if possible, not to arrest him before he's had his tea." Love, deflated, shuffled off with his notebook. Lionel received the sergeant with the stiffness of a man answering the door to a tax collector. He permitted Love to sit, then folded his hands and awaited interrogation with the patience of a martyr. "You admit, sir, that you wrote this letter?" Love asked, producing the damp-stained sheet with a flourish. Lionel barely glanced at it. "Yes, it was a family matter. A warning, not a threat." Warning him of what exactly? That his behavior was intolerable. He borrowed recklessly, he lied to creditors, and he thought he could charm his way out of anything. "I did not want the family name disgraced." Love sniffed. "So you had reason to silence him?" Lionel's eyes narrowed. Inspector Purbright would not leap to such melodrama. "Might I suggest you leave the thinking to him?" Love flushed crimson and stuffed the letter back in his pocket. He returned to the station, muttering about insolent men who deserved to be guilty. Purbright listened without interruption, then said mildly, "You did well, Love. A suspect who corrects his accuser is often one with something to hide. But it may not be what we expect." The real jolt in the case came that evening, when the town's peace was disturbed by a second tragedy. This time it was not a groom collapsing at an altar, but a shop window shattering on Market Street. Mr. Fenby, proprietor of the draper's shop, swore he had seen a figure dash across the square, hurl a brick, and vanish into the drizzle. The window displayed, of all things, bridal gowns, and upon the shattered sill, as if left deliberately, lay another rose petal, this one pale and crumpled, but unmistakably from the same roses that had adorned St. Swithin's on the wedding day. By the time Purbright arrived, a small crowd had gathered, whispering eagerly. "It's her," they insisted. "The bride. First the groom, now a window. She's gone quite mad." Pauline Larch, however, was at that moment still cloistered under Mrs. Frobisher's indignant protection, weeping quietly into a handkerchief, while her cousin berated the milkman for daring to suggest otherwise. Purbright examined the petal with his usual calm. "Curious," he said, "how flowers seem to wander about this town in the most unexpected places." Sergeant Love looked baffled. "You mean someone planted it, sir?" Purbright replaced the petal gently on the sill. "I mean, Sergeant, that when people wish a story to grow, they are not above watering it with symbols." The next day, Flaxborough seethed with fresh certainty. Pauline was no longer merely a murderess in waiting, but a hysterical vandal. Ladies at the hairdresser's spoke of fits of temper. The landlord at the Feathers Inn announced that the poor girl's mind had gone, like butter left out in the sun. Only Purbright seemed unmoved, going about with his deliberate air of politeness, as though solving a crossword puzzle at his own pace while the town frothed around him. He spent part of the afternoon interviewing Edgar Clume again at the furniture shop. Clume, nervous and lanky, swore he had seen Lionel himself loitering near the market that evening. Tall figure, coat collar up, couldn't mistake the walk, and after the window went, he was nowhere to be seen. Purbright listened, then asked, "Did you see the brick thrown?" "No, sir, but who else could it be?" "Indeed," murmured Purbright. "Who else indeed?" That evening, Purbright paid a quiet visit to Mrs. Bullitt, the triple widow. She received him with delighted surprise, convinced at last that her testimony was being properly valued. "Inspector, I always said the girl was guilty, but mark me, there's more. I saw a man, the night before the wedding, slipping out of the Petherick shop. He carried something in a bag, a heavy shape like bottles. When he saw me, he ducked his head. I couldn't swear, but it looked like Lionel. Purbright thanked her politely, though inwardly he discounted half of what she said. Widows of Mrs. Bullett's type were prone to embroidery. Still, the notion of bottles lingered in his mind. By the week's end, suspicion in Flaxborough had shifted uneasily. Pauline remained the favorite villain, but Lionel now hovered at the edges of people's conversations. Had he threatened his brother? Was he jealous, resentful, or worse? The town was delighted to divide itself into factions like supporters of rival football clubs. Sergeant Love, meanwhile, was torn between his instinct to convict Pauline and his eagerness to satisfy the inspector's suspicions about Lionel. He carried both theories with equal fervor, depending on the moment. 2 suspects, sir, he declared proudly one morning. That means we're getting closer. Purbright gave him a look of weary indulgence. 2 suspects, Love, usually means we are no nearer than when we had none. But patience. Truth seldom travels faster than rumor, though it does occasionally arrive. Late that night, Purbright returned alone to St. Swithin's. The church was locked, but the vicar, weary of interruptions, had left him a key. He walked slowly down the aisle, his footsteps echoing. The scent of roses had long since faded, yet he could still picture the scattered petals, the bride's white knuckles, the congregation's gasp. Near the altar rail he crouched and ran his fingers lightly along the stone floor. It was smooth, worn by generations, yet faint scratches marked the place where Colin Petherick had fallen. Scratches that might have been made by a silver-knobbed walking stick. Purbright straightened, the faintest shadow of a smile crossing his face. Yes, he murmured to the empty church. Convenient narratives are rarely honest. But scratches? Scratches do not lie. Outside, the rain began again, gentle at first, then pattering with insistence. In the town beyond the churchyard, windows glowed with lamplight and whispered speculation. They did not yet know it, but the story of the bride who killed her groom was starting to fray. Threads were loosening, and soon the whole fabric would unravel. And Inspector Purbright, patient as ever, was content to wait for the final tug. Morning in Flaxborough arrived sodden and grey, as though the sky itself had been wrung out over the town. By now, the gossip had reached such a pitch that no one could buy a loaf, a pint, or a packet of pins without being offered at least 3 theories on how Colin Petherick had met his end. The bride remained, in most accounts, the chief culprit, but Lionel Petherick's name had begun to be whispered with almost equal relish. A community that thrived on moral certainty was discovering that ambiguity could be even more entertaining. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, treated the town's speculations with his usual patience. That morning, he sat at his desk, leafing through Sergeant Love's latest sheaf of witness notes. Love, flushed with the effort of transcription, hovered like a dog awaiting praise. "Well, sir," the sergeant began, "we have half a dozen people swearing they saw Lionel near the market on the night of the window breaking. One even says he carried a brick." Purbright adjusted his spectacles. "Did any of them, by chance, see him throw it?" Love faltered. "Not exactly, but he was seen hurrying away." Hurrying away is one of Flaxborough's most popular pastimes, Sergeant. Rarely incriminating." Love sighed. "Still, it gives us 2 solid suspects." "Solid, perhaps," Purbright murmured, "but not necessarily weighty. Let us remember that a crowd's certainty is not proof, but enthusiasm." He set the papers down. "Today, I think we should learn more of Mr. Petherick's finances. The dead man, not the living one." The bank manager, a brisk little man named Groom, received them with the wariness of one accustomed to guarding secrets not his own. His office smelled of ink and polish, and the ledgers on his desk were as neatly stacked as altar cloths. "Yes, Inspector," he said, polishing his spectacles as though the question might be written upon them. Mr. Colin Petherick had accounts here, a current one, frequently overdrawn, and a small investment portfolio, not well chosen. More to the point, he owed money to several creditors, some here in town, some further afield. His appetite for expansion outpaced his ability to finance it. Purbright nodded gently. And the policy? The insurance? Groom coughed. Ah, yes. He had taken a policy out only 3 weeks before his death. Quite a generous sum, payable to his intended wife, Miss Larch. It was, if I may say, an unusual move for a man with no fortune and many debts. Unusual, Purbright repeated softly. But convenient, perhaps, for someone. Tell me, who advised him of such a policy? The manager adjusted his spectacles again. The agent was a Mr. Pym. He calls on many in the town, a persuasive fellow. Purbright thanked him and rose. As they left, Sergeant Love muttered, "There you have it, sir. She was set to inherit, clear as daylight." Daylight, Love, Purbright said, is frequently the best time for seeing shadows. Their next call was on Mr. Pym himself, an insurance man whose manner suggested he could sell frost to a snowman. His office was cluttered with pamphlets promising security, peace of mind, and a legacy for loved ones. "Terrible affair, Inspector," Pym said, shaking his head solemnly. "I was as shocked as anyone. Poor fellow signed the papers not 3 weeks ago. He seemed almost desperate. Said he wanted to ensure his bride would be cared for, should anything happen." Very touching. "Did he seem in ill health?" Purbright asked. "Not particularly. A little pale, perhaps, but I assumed it was the usual wedding nerves." Purbright studied him a moment longer. "And did he mention who suggested such foresight? Was it his idea, or yours?" Pym smiled thinly. "Why, Inspector, I offer suggestions, but the choice is always the client's. Mr. Petherick was very firm about it, quite insistent, in fact. When they left, Love whispered, 'He practically admitted it, sir.' Colin meant her to have the money, if she knew. That's motive." "Perhaps," Purbright murmured. "Or perhaps someone else knew." That afternoon, the inspector paid another visit to Mrs. Frobisher's parlour. Pauline sat by the fire, pale and exhausted, while her cousin hovered protectively. "Miss Larch," Purbright began in his courteous tone, "were you aware that your fiancé had taken out an insurance policy in your name?" Pauline's eyes widened with genuine astonishment. "An insurance policy? Number I knew nothing of it. Colin never told me." Mrs. Frobisher drew herself up indignantly. "And why should she know? Men have their secrets, Inspector, though some are more expensive than others." Purbright inclined his head. "Indeed. But secrets, Mrs. Frobisher, have a way of turning into debts owed by the innocent." Pauline pressed her hands together. "Inspector, I swear to you I had no idea. If I had, I might never have agreed to marry him." Purbright gave her a long, unreadable look. Then he said gently, "Sometimes, Miss Larch, ignorance is more dangerous than guilt." By evening the town had learned, as towns somehow always do, about the insurance policy. Pauline's denial meant nothing. To Flaxborough she was now doubly guilty. Of murder for money and of deceit in protest. At the Feathers Inn the talk rose to fever pitch, men pounding the bar with their tankards and demanding her arrest. The ladies at the hairdresser's rehearsed her trial, complete with tearless sobs and a gallows. Yet in his office, Purbright sat quietly, staring at a scrap of paper on his desk. It was the note found in the yard of the furniture shop, Lionel's threat to Colin. "Break it off, or it will end badly for you." Purbright's gaze lingered on the damp smudges, the handwriting strained with anger. Beside it lay the bag of sugared almonds, still awaiting laboratory confirmation, and the single rose petal from the church aisle. 3 trifles, each unconvincing alone, but together forming a pattern that teased at the edge of meaning. Love entered, still buoyed by gossip. "The town's ready to see her hanged, sir. It'll be a relief to them when we put it in motion." Purbright looked up, his expression mild. Relief, Sergeant, is not always the same as justice. That night brought yet another twist. A constable on patrol reported that Lionel Petherick had been seen entering the churchyard after dark, carrying a lantern. By the time the constable approached, Lionel had vanished, leaving only the faint smell of paraffin and the impression of fresh footprints on the wet grass. When confronted the next morning, Lionel was curt. "I went to pray for my brother. Is that now a crime in Flaxborough?" Purbright regarded him steadily. "Prayer is not a crime. But secrecy often precedes something less holy. Tell me, did you happen to take anything with you when you left?" Lionel's mouth tightened. Certainly not. But Purbright, with his gift for reading men, saw in the stiffness of Lionel's shoulders a different answer. By the week's end, Flaxborough was a cauldron of rumor, its surface bubbling furiously. Pauline remained besieged, Lionel suspicious, and the town divided between those who believed in poison, those who swore by insurance fraud, and those who favored sheer melodrama. The only certainty was that Inspector Purbright, maddeningly calm, refused to close the matter. He walked the streets in the drizzle, observing, listening, collecting fragments. The silver-knobbed stick with its scratches, the unsent letter, the almonds, the petals. Each, to the town, was proof of Pauline's guilt, but to Purbright they were hints, small ripples upon water that betrayed the movements of something larger beneath. And one evening, as he sat once more in his office, he murmured to himself, "People die of many things, of hearts, of debts, of secrets. But rarely do they die for reasons that please their neighbors." He closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of patience heavy but familiar. Somewhere within Flaxborough's damp respectability, a truth lay waiting. And when it came, it would not be the neat, convenient truth the town demanded. It would be something far untidier, something that, once revealed, would change the story of the bride who killed her groom into something else entirely. The Sunday following Colin Petherick's sudden death dawned with the kind of light that makes a town appear more respectable than it deserves. Rain-washed cobbles gleamed, the market square smelt faintly of soap rather than horse, and the bells of St. Swithin's tolled with obstinate cheerfulness. Yet beneath this veneer, Flaxborough was restless. People hurried to their pews less for worship than for a chance to observe who sat where, who whispered to whom, and who looked guilty. Inspector Purbright, seated unobtrusively at the back, allowed the vicar's sermon on forgiveness to wash over him without effect. His eyes strayed instead to Lionel Petherick, stiff in his pew, lips pursed as though hymn-singing were a frivolous indulgence. Pauline Larch did not attend. Her cousin had kept her behind locked doors, safe from both hostile whispers and sympathetic intrusions. In her absence, she was spoken of with more conviction than if she had been present. The entire congregation seemed united by one silent resolution. If the bride was not guilty, she ought to have been. After the service, as parishioners gathered in damp clusters beneath the lich gate, Purbright listened politely to remarks offered in lowered voices. "Tragic affair," murmured one. "Unnatural calm she showed," said another. "And Lionel skulking about at night. What's that about?" added a third, eyes gleaming. Purbright nodded at each, comment as though noting the weather. His manner suggested agreement, though his thoughts were elsewhere. It was not the intensity of suspicion that interested him, but its direction, how it swung like a weathercock, first toward Pauline, then toward Lionel, depending on which tale had been most recently told. The town was not hunting truth. It was rehearsing a story that pleased it. That afternoon, Sergeant Love burst into the inspector's office with the urgency of a man clutching revelation. "Sir, the lab report's come through at last. On the almonds." He slapped the paper down with triumph. Traces of cyanide. Purbright lifted the sheet and read with his usual calm. Traces, yes. Not sufficient to kill a man. Possibly contamination from storage. Possibly deliberate. He set the paper aside. Tell me, Sergeant, did anyone actually see Mr. Petherick eat an almond? Love faltered. Well, no. But if they were poisoned, surely they were meant for him. Or, Purbright said gently, for someone else. Or for no one at all, merely to be found. Love frowned, his excitement cooling. Planted, you mean? Perhaps. Or perhaps a clumsy attempt at melodrama. Either way, the almonds do not explain why Colin Petherick collapsed precisely when he did. And timing, Sergeant, is everything. Late that day, Purbright paid another visit to the Petherick shop. Edgar Clume, the lanky assistant, was rearranging lampshades with a nervous hand. He brightened when he saw the inspector, as though expecting praise for enduring suspicion by association. Inspector, I've remembered something, Clume said eagerly. The day before the wedding, Mr. Petherick argued with his brother right here in the shop. Colin accused Lionel of meddling in his affairs, said he'd ruin everything. Lionel stormed out, slammed the door so hard a vase fell. I picked up the pieces myself. Purbright inclined his head. Thank you, Mr. Clume. Did either gentleman mention specifics? Money, Clume said promptly, and something about a letter. Colin laughed, said he wasn't afraid of threats. I thought it odd. Purbright let silence stretch, watching Clume fidget. Then he said, And you, Mr. Clume, what do you stand to gain from your employer's death? Clume's jaw dropped. Nothing. Why should I? Why indeed, Purbright murmured, but resentment is rarely as rare a commodity as people suppose. He left Clume pale and sweating among his lampshades. That evening, while the inspector was writing up his notes, a constable brought word of another small disturbance. Lionel had again been seen prowling the churchyard. This time he carried no lantern, but a neighbour swore she glimpsed him kneeling by the altar rail inside. The vicar confirmed the door had been left unlocked. Love was jubilant. He's hiding something, sir. He's gone back twice. Perhaps he left the poison there. Purbright folded his hands. Or perhaps, Sergeant, he is merely returning to the place where his quarrel with his brother became fatal. Grief often takes peculiar forms. But if he's grieving, why sneak? Purbright's eyes glinted faintly. Because open grief is respectable, while secrecy invites speculation. And speculation in Flaxborough is more dangerous than guilt. The following day brought a curious visitor to the station. Mr. Pym, the insurance agent. He appeared agitated, twisting his bowler hat in his hands. Inspector, I must speak plainly. There's been talk, ugly talk, that I pushed Colin Petherick into that policy. It isn't true. He came to me. He was desperate to have it done quickly. Almost frantic. He said it was the only way to silence his creditors. Purbright leaned back. Interesting. Did he mention who those creditors were? Pym hesitated. Some in town, some further afield. But one name I recall. Mr. Fenby, the draper. He was pressing hard for repayment. Purbright made a note. Thank you, Mr. Pym. You have been very helpful. When the agent had gone, Love asked, Do you think Fenby might be involved, sir? Possibly. But remember, debts create more resentment than love ever has. We must tread carefully. That evening, Purbright took a solitary walk through the marketplace. Lamps flickered in the mist. Shops closed one by one. He paused outside Fenby's drapery, its shattered window still patched with boards. The scent of damp cloth wafted from within. He tapped the boards lightly, as though listening for an answer, then continued on. In his mind, the fragments were beginning to align. Lionel's letter, Colin's debts, the almonds, the bouquet petal, the scratches on the floor. None proved murder, yet all suggested a stage carefully set. Someone had arranged symbols, petals, poisoned sweets, rumors, to direct suspicion toward Pauline. But why her? Why so publicly? Purbright's instinct whispered that the true motive lay not in romance, but in something far less dramatic. Money, property, the small brutalities of business. The bride was useful because she was silent, pale, and easy to despise. The next morning, Flaxborough awoke to another rumor, more delicious than the rest. Lionel had been arrested. This was not true, though Sergeant Love had come perilously close to making it so. He returned to the station flushed with frustration. "He practically admitted it, sir," Love insisted. "I pressed him about the letter, and he said he didn't regret writing it. Said he'd been right to warn Colin. If that isn't guilt, what is?" Purbright regarded him kindly. "Sergeant, guilt is rarely so obliging as to confess itself in phrases fit for a headline. More often it hides behind indignation. Mr. Lionel Petherick, I think, has more indignation than guilt. But he does know something. We shall let him stew a little longer." Love subsided, though reluctantly. That afternoon, another voice entered, the chorus. Mrs. Glibbs, the sweet shop keeper. She arrived at the station with a solemn expression and a box of humbugs. "Inspector, I've remembered something important. The day before the wedding, I saw Mr. Petherick, Colin, walking with a stranger, a tall man with a limp. Never seen him before. They looked to be arguing, and Colin had a paper in his hand, waving it about." Purbright accepted the humbugs, thanked her, and said nothing of his thoughts. But as he unwrapped one later, he considered a stranger, a limp, a paper waved angrily. Could it be another creditor, or someone tied to the insurance? Whatever the truth, it deepened the mystery. And deep mysteries, Purbright knew, had a habit of collapsing into something simple at the end, if one only waited long enough. That night, as rain rattled against the station windows, Purbright lingered over his notes. Love had long since gone home. The inspector arranged the scraps before him like puzzle pieces. The sugared almonds, too weak to kill; the policy, too recent to be coincidence; the brother, too stiff to be innocent; the bride, too convenient to be true. He murmured to himself, "Who benefits?" The words hung in the stillness. Not the bride. She swore ignorance, and her manner convinced him. Not Lionel. His bitterness was real, but it was not greedy. The answer must lie elsewhere, hidden in plain sight. Purbright leaned back, eyes half closed, listening to the drip of rain. He thought of Flaxborough itself, with its appetite for scandal, its eagerness to condemn. Someone had fed that appetite deliberately. Someone who understood that in a town so hungry for tales, the easiest way to hide the truth was to offer them a story they liked better. And in the hush of the office, he allowed himself the faintest smile. The bride who killed her groom indeed. It was a play, and someone, somewhere in Flaxborough, was the playwright. The rain slackened by Monday morning, but Flaxborough's mood remained sodden and unsettled. Market stalls went up in the square with a kind of dreary determination, as though vegetables and second-hand books could withstand the weight of scandal. Shoppers leaned across counters, not so much to inspect produce as to exchange the newest morsels of the Petherick affair. Inspector Purbright, stepping from the police station with his umbrella furled neatly beneath his arm, listened without appearing to do so. A fishmonger confided to a butcher that the bride had been seen pacing her cousin's parlor like a caged animal. A greengrocer whispered that Lionel had withdrawn a suspicious sum from his bank account. None of it carried proof, but in Flaxborough, proof was considered a vulgar necessity. Sergeant Love, meanwhile, was restless with what he regarded as progress. He joined the inspector on his walk, his notebook bristling with scribbled suspicions. "Sir, we must narrow it down. If we don't move soon, the town will think we've lost hold of it entirely." Purbright glanced at him mildly. "The town thinks many things, Sergeant. Most of them before breakfast. Our duty is not to keep pace with its imagination, but to discover something more obstinate. Truth. Love, unconsoled, muttered about cyanide, almonds, and insurance policies. Purbright let him mutter. He was thinking of scratches on stone, a bouquet petal, and a stranger with a limp. Their first call of the day was upon Mr. Fenby, the draper whose shop window had so dramatically shattered. He received them in his cluttered back office, the air thick with the scent of cloth and mothballs. His hands, pale from years of handling bolts of fabric, fidgeted with a length of ribbon. "A sorry business, Inspector," he began. "But if you're here about the window, I must protest. I have been unfairly accused. I had nothing to do with the groom's death either, I assure you." Purbright's eyebrows lifted with courteous surprise. "We had not accused you of either, Mr. Fenby. But since you raise the matter, you were one of Colin Petherick's creditors, were you not?" Fenby flushed. A small matter. A debt for material supplied. Nothing that would cause, well, murder. Love interjected. "Yet you pressed him for repayment, sir, didn't you?" "He took out an insurance policy not long after." The draper fumbled with the ribbon until it snapped. "I pressed him, yes. He owed me. But that was business, Sergeant. Honest business." He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "If you want scandal, look to his brother, or the girl. Don't drag me into it." Purbright thanked him politely and left him sweating among his fabrics. As they stepped into the square again, he remarked, "Curious, is it not, how swiftly the innocent point elsewhere?" That afternoon, a fresh witness appeared at the station, a boy who delivered newspapers. He was small, mud-splattered, and eager to impress. "Please, sir," he told Love, "the day before the wedding I saw Mr. Colin Petherick talking to a tall man by the river. The man walked funny like he'd a stiff leg. They argued, and Mr. Petherick shoved him. The man dropped something shiny. A bottle, I think." Love nearly dragged the boy into Purbright's office, triumphant. "The stranger with the limp again, sir. Now we've got corroboration." Purbright offered the boy a boiled sweet, listened to the tale, and asked only one question. "Did you see what became of the bottle?" "No, sir. They went on arguing. Then the man limped off fast." When the boy had gone, Love declared, "This proves it. The limp fellow poisoned him." Purbright, however, only said, "Perhaps." Or perhaps he carried more debts than legs. The town grew hotter with speculation as the week went on. Mrs. Bullitt claimed she had seen Lionel and the stranger together in quiet conversation. Mrs. Glibbs insisted she'd overheard Pauline quarreling with her cousin behind closed curtains. Each new tale deepened the fog. Purbright continued with his calm inquiries. He interviewed the vicar once more, who remembered nothing useful, but did recall that the Petherick brothers had chosen St. Swithin's for the wedding chiefly because the hire fee was lower than at the registry office. He spoke again to Edgar Clume, who produced yet another story, this time about a parcel Colin had insisted be hidden in the shop's cellar the night before he died. Love was dispatched to investigate. He returned with a dusty crate containing little more than pamphlets for fitted kitchens of tomorrow, and a ledger with alarming sums in red ink. "See, sir," Love said, triumphant again. Proof he was desperate. Purbright turned a page, noting the entries with calm detachment. Desperate, yes. But desperation breeds many enemies. Who among them wished him dead? On Thursday evening, Purbright attended a meeting of the town council, officially to present a brief report on crime rates, unofficially to observe. Council chambers were fertile ground for grudges disguised as civic virtue. As expected, the Petherick affair arose the moment business of drains and lamp-posts had concluded. Councillor Crispin, red-faced and pompous, demanded that the culprit be brought to book, and soon, lest Flaxborough appear lax in its moral standards. Councillor Mossop, more cautious, suggested that delays in the investigation reflect poorly on the constabulary. Purbright listened with a polite smile, contributed nothing, and departed with the faint impression that both counsellors would be delighted to see Pauline convicted, if only to prove that order had been restored. In Flaxborough, justice was measured less in facts than in the tidiness of endings. That night, as mist curled through the town, a small but telling incident occurred. A constable on patrol spotted Lionel once again near St. Swithin's. This time he was not kneeling or praying. He appeared to be searching, hands brushing the grass, eyes scanning the ground with tense urgency. When challenged, Lionel snapped, "I lost something." "None of your business." He stalked off, leaving the constable puzzled. The report reached Purbright the next morning. He read it without comment, though a flicker of interest stirred behind his mild eyes. A man searching in the night for something near the altar rail where his brother had fallen. What could it be? A letter dropped? A bottle? A clue mislaid in panic? Meanwhile, Pauline's condition worsened. Mrs. Frobisher reported to the inspector that her cousin had become pale, withdrawn and fearful. "She won't eat, Inspector. She says food tastes bitter. She sits at the window as if she expects stones to come flying through." Purbright visited that afternoon. Pauline sat by the fire, staring into the flames. She looked up only once, when Purbright said gently, "Miss Larch, do you trust anyone in Flaxborough?" Her eyes brimmed with tears. "I used to. Not now. They all look at me as if they're certain. But I didn't touch him, Inspector. You must believe me." Purbright bowed his head. "Belief, Miss Larch, is not required. Patience is." Back at the station, Love paced restlessly. "She's convincing, sir, I'll grant you. But if not her, then Lionel. And if not Lionel, this mysterious stranger. It must be one of the three." "Possibly," Purbright said, arranging papers on his desk. "But certainty is dangerous, Sergeant. It closes doors too soon." Love muttered, "Well, we can't just wait forever." Purbright smiled faintly. "On the contrary, waiting is often the surest form of progress. People betray themselves not in what they do when watched, but in what they cannot resist doing when ignored." That night, Purbright returned once more to the church. The rain had stopped. Moonlight silvered the stones. He knelt near the altar rail, running his fingers over the scratches again. Then, shifting slightly, he found what he had half expected, a tiny shard of glass lodged in the crevice between stones. He lifted it carefully, holding it to the light. A bottle, he thought. Something dropped or broken in haste, and perhaps what Lionel had been searching for. He slipped the shard into his pocket, rose, and stood in the silence of the church. Outside, Flaxborough slumbered in false certainty. Inside, Purbright allowed himself a single thought, spoken only to the shadows. The play is nearly written. Only the final act remains. And with that, he extinguished the lantern, leaving the church in darkness. By Friday, Flaxborough had reached a feverish state of self-satisfaction. The town considered itself not merely witness to a crime, but participant in its solving. Each shop, each parlour, each corner table at the Feathers Inn declared itself a miniature court of justice, rendering verdicts with cheerful certainty. Pauline Larch remained the popular villain. Lionel Petherick, a close second. The mysterious stranger with the limp had become, in some tellings, a hitman from Leeds. In others, a foreign adventurer bent on blackmail. It scarcely mattered. Flaxborough enjoyed the embroidery more than the fabric. Inspector Purbright, however, remained unhurried. On that bright but brittle morning, he invited Sergeant Love to accompany him on a small excursion. "We shall," he explained with his usual mildness, "retrace Mr. Petherick's final hours. Sometimes a walk, Sergeant, uncovers more than weeks of conjecture." Love, armed with his notebook and impatience, followed eagerly. Their first stop was the Petherick shop. Edgar Clume greeted them nervously, eager once again to prove his usefulness. He repeated his tale of the quarrel between the brothers, adding fresh flourishes about Colin's red face and Lionel's clenched fists. Purbright listened, then asked quietly, "Mr. Clume, do you recall whether your employer left the shop with anything on the morning of the wedding?" Clume frowned, thinking hard. "Yes, sir. He took a small parcel from the counter, wrapped in brown paper, said it was a gift, I assumed for his bride." Purbright's eyes glimmered faintly. "A gift, yes. Did you see it again?" "No, sir." "Never." As they departed, Love whispered, "A gift poisoned, perhaps." "Or," Purbright said softly, "a gift stolen." Their next visit was to the draper, Fenby. He was less defensive than before, almost nervous. "I've told you all I know, Inspector. Colin owed me money, yes, but I'd no wish him harm. As for Lionel, well, he was forever trying to cover his brother's foolishness. Bitter man, but no murderer." Purbright regarded him gently. "And yet you did not mind being named in town as one of Colin's most pressing creditors." Fenby's lips twitched. "I can't stop what people say. All I know is, he promised to repay me after the wedding. Promised the money was coming, out of the blue," he said. "A windfall." "A windfall," Purbright repeated. "How reassuring for a man drowning in debt." "Thank you, Mr. Fenby." Outside, Love muttered, "That proves the insurance, sir." He planned to use it to pay debts. "Perhaps," Purbright said, "but there are windfalls that do not require death. We must not assume the worst until it insists upon itself." By noon, they arrived at the Gazette office. Editor Mortlake greeted them with cautious enthusiasm. "Inspector, I hope you don't mind, but the paper has had to keep pace with the appetite for news. If we don't supply the public, rumor does. It's a matter of civic duty." Purbright's eyes twinkled. "Indeed, Mr. Mortlake. And perhaps you could tell me about a letter I happened to glimpse on your desk the other day, unsigned, alleging Miss Larch kept company with another man." Mortlake coughed into his mustache. "Pure invention, Inspector. Such letters arrive with every scandal. We rarely print them." "Rarely?" Mortlake shifted uneasily. "Well, never in this case. It seemed cruel. The girl has enough to endure." Purbright gave him a courteous nod. "Wise of you. Still, one wonders who found it useful to send such a letter in the first place." Later that day, Purbright requested the company of the vicar at the church. Together they walked to the altar rail, where the inspector gestured at the scratches in the stone. "Tell me, Vicar," he said, "did anyone else have access here after the wedding, before the body was removed?" The vicar frowned. "Only myself, the verger, and doctor. Binns. But I confess I did not watch closely. People were in and out, whispering, comforting. It was confusion. And Lionel. He was here, yes. Very pale, very stiff. He knelt for a moment before his brother's body was taken away." Purbright inclined his head. "Thank you. That is helpful." The vicar, puzzled, asked, "Inspector, do you truly think the bride innocent?" Purbright allowed a small smile. "I think innocence and guilt are rarely as convenient as the town prefers." That evening, the inspector invited Lionel to the station. The elder Petherick entered with his usual stiffness, lips compressed into a narrow line. "Mr. Petherick," Purbright began, "you have been seen in the churchyard at night. May I ask what you sought?" Lionel's eyes flashed. "I sought peace, prayer. If that is a crime, arrest me." "Not prayer," Purbright said mildly. "Something lost, perhaps a bottle, a fragment of glass, perhaps, dropped near the altar rail?" For the first time Lionel faltered. His gaze flickered, then steadied. "I know nothing of bottles. If you have proof, show it." Purbright regarded him silently until the silence itself became unbearable. At last, Lionel muttered, "Colin disgraced us all. If you think I'm sorry he's gone, I'm not. But I didn't kill him." When he had gone, Love said, "That's near enough a confession." On the contrary, Purbright replied, it is merely honesty, and honesty, Sergeant, is rarely criminal. The following day brought yet another twist. Mrs. Glibbs, always eager for relevance, produced what she called evidence. It was a purse found near the riverbank containing a visiting card. On it was scrawled a name, Mr. Halliday. I've never heard of him, she said, breathless, but it must be the stranger with the limp. Purbright accepted the purse with care. The card was damp, but the writing was clear. Halliday. He made no remark to Mrs. Glibbs, but inwardly he felt a stir of recognition. A name mentioned in one of Colin's ledgers. Halliday, £20 owing. A creditor then. At the station, Love examined it eagerly. So this Halliday killed him, a creditor with a grudge. Perhaps slipped him poison in the church. Or, Purbright said softly, perhaps Halliday merely quarrelled. Not all quarrels end in death. By Sunday evening, the case had become a tangle. To the town it was simple. The bride was guilty, Lionel suspicious, Halliday a shadowy accomplice. But Purbright, alone in his office, spread before him the fragments once again. The almonds with faint cyanide, too weak to kill. The bouquet petal, out of place, deliberate. The scratches on stone, silver-knobbed walking stick. The letter, Lionel's warning. The card, Halliday, the creditor. Each clue seemed to lean toward Pauline, yet in its very convenience it betrayed artifice. Someone had arranged these pieces to direct suspicion, just as one might arrange furniture to disguise a crack in the wall. Purbright lit his pipe, though he did not smoke it, and murmured to himself, guilt lies not in the symbols, but in the hand that arranges them. And in Flaxborough, that hand is never the one most pointed at. He leaned back, eyes half closed. The play was advancing to its climax. The actors, the bride, the brother, the stranger, were all on stage. Only the curtain of truth had yet to rise, and Inspector Purbright, patient as ever, was ready to pull the cord. The Monday morning that opened the 10th chapter of Flaxborough's scandal was deceptively ordinary. Market carts trundled over the wet cobbles. The school children clattered down lanes with slates under their arms, and the vicar rehearsed his homily on the virtue of discretion. Yet underneath the ordinary pulse of the town lay the taut expectancy of an audience awaiting the final act of a play. At the police station, Sergeant Love was already pacing when Inspector Purbright arrived. The sergeant's notebook bristled with scribbles, half-legible underlinings, and triumphant arrows that all seemed to point directly at the bride. "Sir," Love began breathlessly, "I've spoken to 3 separate witnesses this morning. All of them swear that Miss Larch bought arsenical weed killer at the chemist's 2 weeks ago. Surely that settles it." Purbright removed his hat with unhurried care, set it on the peg, and looked at Love as one might regard a child who had brought home a particularly ugly seashell. "Did they also recall, Sergeant, what she did with it? Sprinkled it into flower beds, perhaps, or tipped it straight into the altar wine?" Love faltered. "Well, none of them actually saw her use it. But arsenic is arsenic." Purbright murmured, settling behind his desk. "So is laundry powder, yet it seldom kills grooms at the altar. Perhaps you might verify the chemist's records before sentencing Miss Larch." Love flushed, made a note, and muttered something about the obvious. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Dr. Binns, the town's physician, entered with his usual air of a schoolmaster announcing a detention. He carried a folder of papers, which he deposited on Purbright's desk. "Inspector," he said briskly, "I've received the results of further tests on Petherick's remains. Trace amounts of digitalis. Enough to unsettle the heart, especially a weak one. It would not take much more to tip him into collapse." Love leapt to his feet. "There. Poison, sir. Poison plain and simple." Purbright looked at the report. "Digitalis. derived from foxglove, and available, I dare say, in half the gardens of Flaxborough. Binns sniffed. Quite. But it narrows the possibilities. Someone administered it, and I suppose you'll want to know how. Purbright inclined his head. Indeed, Doctor, but before that, one must ask, why at the altar? Why not in the breakfast tea? Why not at the rehearsal dinner? Timing, you see, is always as telling as the substance itself. The doctor, unimpressed by philosophy, gathered his papers. Well, I've told you what I know. Do what you will with it. When he had gone, Love exhaled triumphantly. Now she's finished, sir. The bride must have given it him before the ceremony. Maybe slipped into a glass of sherry. Perhaps, Purbright said mildly. Or perhaps not. Do you recall, Sergeant, whether anyone saw Colin drink anything at all that morning? Love paused. Come to think of it, no. He looked pale already, didn't he? Purbright smiled faintly. Indeed, pale enough that even poison might claim credit it did not earn. That evening, Purbright returned quietly to Mrs. Frobisher's parlour. Pauline sat pale by the hearth, her hands folded tight. She looked up as he entered. Inspector, she said softly, they all believe it. The whole town. I can feel it in the way they stare. They want me guilty. Purbright settled into a chair. The town prefers guilt to uncertainty, Miss Larch. It saves them the effort of patience. She shivered. But I never touched him. I scarcely spoke to him that morning. She hesitated. We were hardly in love. But I would not have killed him. Purbright studied her face with the stillness of a man observing a bird on a branch. At last he said, Tell me, did your fiancé carry anything unusual with him that morning? She frowned, searching memory. Yes, a small parcel. He wouldn't say what it was. He tucked it under his arm as we drove to the church. Purbright nodded slowly. A gift, perhaps, or an insurance. Pauline's eyes widened. Inspector, do you think Colin poisoned himself? Purbright did not answer directly. I think men sometimes prefer to stage their exits in ways that secure advantage for those left behind. Or disadvantage. He rose, offering her the gentlest of bows. Rest assured, Miss Larch. Truth has a way of refusing to stay buried. The following morning, the constable on night patrol delivered a new piece of curiosity. Near the churchyard, he had found a scrap of paper half buried in mud. It proved to be a torn corner of a letter, with only a few words legible. If you do not pay by Friday, consequences will... Love waved it like a banner. Halliday again, sir, the creditor. Must be his threat. Friday, the very day of the wedding. Purbright examined the scrap with delicate fingers. Perhaps. Or perhaps another creditor. Or perhaps written by Colin himself to dramatize his own plight. He tucked it into his pocket. A puzzle piece, Sergeant. But puzzles require patience. By midweek, Flaxborough's gossip had reached operatic heights. At the Feathers Inn, the landlord declared Pauline had laced the almonds with cyanide. At the hairdresser's, customers insisted Lionel had struck Colin with his silver-knobbed stick. In the post office queue, someone swore the stranger Halliday had delivered a fatal blow. Each theory contradicted the next, yet all were held with equal conviction. Purbright observed it all with his quiet, courteous smile. He knew the town's frenzy was not obstacle, but tool. While everyone rehearsed melodrama, the true story slipped quietly beneath. On Thursday afternoon, he summoned Lionel to the station once again. The elder Petherick sat stiff-backed, his expression tight. Mr. Petherick, Purbright began, your brother carried a parcel the morning of his death. Do you know what it contained? Lionel's face twitched. Number he kept secrets. Always secrets. Indeed. And you, sir, have you ever used digitalis? Lionel stared. Certainly not. Purbright's eyes were mild. Your walking stick, Mr. Petherick. It left scratches on the church floor. Were you, in your distress, striking the stone?" Lionel's composure cracked for a moment. "Yes. I struck the floor. My brother was a fool. He ruined everything. I struck the stone, not him." His voice shook. "I hated him, Inspector. But I did not kill him." When he had gone, Love burst out, "That's guilt if ever I heard it." Purbright only replied, "That is bitterness, Sergeant. And bitterness is far more common than guilt." That evening, Purbright returned alone to St. Swithin's. The church was quiet, the air still faintly scented of roses long since wilted. At the altar rail he knelt, touching the stone where Colin had fallen. He drew from his pocket the shard of glass he had found earlier, holding it to the light of his lantern, a fragment of a small bottle. He thought of the parcel, of Colin's pale face, of the insurance policy written in Pauline's name, and of the town's insatiable hunger for a villain. The inspector murmured into the silence, "Sometimes the dead arrange their own theatre, Sergeant. Sometimes the curtain falls because they pull it." By Friday, Purbright had made his decision. He would test his theory, not with evidence alone, but with human nature. He asked Sergeant Love to summon a small gathering at the station: Pauline Larch, Lionel Petherick, Mr. Fenby the draper, and Mr. Pym the insurance agent. To Flaxborough, it would appear the inspector was finally ready to declare guilt. Love bustled about with anticipation. "We'll have the truth out of them at last, sir. Which one shall we lock up?" Purbright, arranging papers with his usual calm, replied only, "Patience, Sergeant." The guilty often reveal themselves when they believe the story has reached its end. And as the lamps glowed in the damp evening and Flaxborough buzzed with certainty that the case was closing, Purbright sat quietly in his office, hands folded, waiting for the play to enter its final act. The bride was innocent, he knew, but the town had not yet learned it. And when it did, Flaxborough would never forget how wrong it had been. The gathering at the police station was conducted with all the gravity of a civic occasion. Word had leaked, no one could say precisely how, that Inspector Purbright intended at last to reveal the guilty party. By dusk, a crowd had formed outside, muffled in coats and gossip, their breath rising in pale clouds against the lamps. They waited not for justice, but for confirmation of the story they had, rehearsed so many nights over parlours and pints. Inside, the atmosphere was quieter, but no less charged. Pauline Larch sat pale and rigid, her hands folded so tightly that her knuckles gleamed. Beside her, Mrs. Frobisher radiated protective outrage, daring anyone to accuse her cousin aloud. Lionel Petherick perched stiffly on a chair, his lips compressed in bitterness. Mr. Fenby, the draper, fidgeted with his hat, while Mr. Pym, the insurance agent, dabbed his forehead with a handkerchief, the picture of nervous perspiration. Sergeant Love presided with his notebook open, glancing eagerly at each face in turn as though ready to pounce. Purbright entered last, his expression mild, his pace unhurried. He removed his hat, set it on the desk, and regarded the small assembly with the air of a man about to read aloud from a parish newsletter. "Thank you for attending. I realize the hour is inconvenient, but clarity is best pursued before it evaporates altogether." Love cleared his throat dramatically, pen poised. Purbright folded his hands. "We are here, of course, because Colin Petherick collapsed at the altar on the day of his wedding. Flaxborough has been energetic in its explanations. Some favor poison in almonds, others a fatal blow from a walking stick, others still a bride's sudden frenzy. Each theory has been delivered with commendable conviction. Unfortunately, conviction is not the same as truth." A stir went around the room. Pauline's lips parted, but she said nothing. Lionel shifted, muttering under his breath. Purbright went on gently. "Doctor, Binns informs us that traces of digitalis were found in Mr. Petherick's body, enough to unseat a weak heart. That, of course, suggests poison. Yet poison requires opportunity. Did anyone see the groom consume food or drink that morning? He let the question hang. No one answered. Precisely, Purbright said. He ate nothing. He drank nothing. So if poison was taken, it was taken before he reached the church. That leaves us to ask, how and by whose hand? Love interjected, She must have done it earlier, sir, the bride. Slipped it into his tea. Purbright's eyes twinkled faintly. And yet Miss Larch has had no opportunity. They were not together that morning. Indeed, several witnesses confirm as much. No, Sergeant. If we follow the thread patiently, it leads elsewhere. He reached into a drawer and produced the tiny shard of glass recovered from the church floor. He held it delicately. This fragment was found near the altar rail, lodged between stones. It belongs to a small bottle. The scratches on the stone suggest something fell, rolled and broke. And you, Mr. Petherick, he turned to Lionel, were seen on more than one occasion searching this very spot. Lionel's face blanched. I lost nothing. On the contrary, Purbright said quietly, you lost your certainty. You feared the bottle would be found and its purpose misunderstood. You were not the one who dropped it, but you feared it would draw suspicion upon you. And so you crept back, hoping to recover it. Lionel's mouth opened, then closed. His shoulders slumped. He brought it himself, he whispered bitterly. I knew it. I saw him tuck it away, some secret tonic. I thought, God help me. I thought he meant to bolster himself. I did not know it would kill him. A gasp escaped Pauline. A tonic? Purbright inclined his head. Yes, Miss Larch. Colin carried a small vial of medicine, digitalis, prescribed perhaps once or acquired by less official means. He intended to steady his heart, to give himself courage for the ceremony. But he miscalculated. Desperation is rarely precise. The inspector placed the shard carefully on the desk. The parcel he carried that morning, Groom saw it. It was not a gift for you, Miss Larch. It was his insurance against collapse. Tragically, it became the cause of it. Silence pressed against the walls. Mrs. Frobisher sputtered indignation. Then she is innocent. My cousin is innocent. Purbright gave a small bow. Innocent of murder, yes. Guilty only of having chosen a man whose ambitions exceeded his health. Love, flustered, tapped his pen. But the almonds, sir, the letter, the window smashed. Ah, Purbright said, the theatre of suspicion. Someone, whether mischievous or malicious, chose to scatter petals, plant almonds, even hurl bricks. It does not matter. These gestures were not the cause of death. They were diversions, exaggerations, or petty acts of spite. Flaxborough prefers a villain to an accident, so it obligingly provided one. He turned toward Lionel, who now sat hollow-eyed. You, sir, threatened your brother with ruin. You resented him, despised him, yet you did not kill him. The irony, of course, is that his own hand completed what your anger only promised. Lionel gave a dry, broken laugh. Then I carry the shame without the guilt. Typical of Colin. He ruins even his own death. Purbright turned last to Pauline. Miss Larch, your silence these days has been mistaken for coldness, your composure for malice. The truth is simpler. You were overwhelmed, bewildered, and you did not weep in public. Flaxborough, however, prefers its heroines in tears. You denied it that satisfaction, and so it cast you as villain. Pauline's eyes brimmed at last. You believe me? Purbright's voice was gentle. Belief is not required, Miss Larch. Only patience. The facts are stubborn enough. Outside the station, the crowd murmured, restless for news. Love, stepping out, announced reluctantly that no arrests were made, that the groom's death had been the result of his own recklessness. The groan of disappointment was audible. Flaxborough did not relish accidents. It had invested too heavily in scandal to accept anticlimax. Yet gradually, as the evening deepened, The crowd dispersed, muttering about weak hearts, foolish men, and the inspector's maddening calm. Inside, Purbright tidied his desk. Love hovered, clearly unsatisfied. "So that's it, sir? He poisoned himself by mistake? And the bride? Cleared?" "Yes, Sergeant." Purbright slid the shard of glass into an envelope. "It is not the ending Flaxborough wanted, but it is the one it shall have. No gallows, no courtroom drama. Merely a man undone by his own pretensions." Love shook his head. "They'll be disappointed." Purbright smiled faintly. "Disappointment, love, is the natural consequence of expecting life to behave like a play. We cannot all have villains on cue." 2 days later, the roses were cleared from St. Swithin's, the cracked boards mended, and services resumed with discreet normality. Pauline Larch, still pale but freer, prepared to leave town with her cousin for a spell by the sea. Lionel retreated into his ordered house, pruning his roses with mechanical severity. Mr. Fenby returned to his bolts of fabric, Mr. Pym to his policies, Mrs. Glibbs to her sweets. Flaxborough, having exhausted itself with speculation, slipped back into its routines, its appetite for drama, unsatisfied but undiminished. Inspector Purbright, in his office, signed reports, shuffled papers, and dictated a short note to county headquarters. Subject deceased by self-administered digitalis. No foul play. Case closed. He laid down his pen, gazed for a moment at the rain beginning once more on the cobbles, and murmured, almost to himself, "Theatre concluded. Audience dispersed, and the stagehands clear the boards." Then he reached for the next file in his tray, a petty matter of bicycles stolen from a shed. The rhythm of Flaxborough resumed, steady as the rain. The end